Hi there! I hope November has found you warm and cozy and that you had a lovely Halloween. I promised you an episode on Jane Austen, but that episode still needs a little bit of time. So instead, I'm going to run you through some of the books I read, and hopefully you can pick up some recommendations. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. I'm your host Jules, and today I'm going to go through what I read in October. It was a very productive reading month. I had a look in my story graph and I read 12 books, which is not an average month for me. If I managed to read 5 or 6, that's a solid month. And well, October I went for it one way or another. Some of the books I read were academic, so they were for work, but a lot of them were also for fun, and those are mainly the ones I'm going to talk about. So, without further ado, let's get into it. The first book I finished in October, notably I did not start it in October, I started ages ago, is The City of Last Chances by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which is part of the Tyrant Philosopher's trilogy series. And I listened to this as an audiobook narrated by David Thorpe. So I actually started listening to this in April and I only finished it on the 3rd of October. So that kind of tells you how long it can take me to finish a book. I already talked about this book in my episode on interesting fantasy books, worlds, endings, etc. because I really enjoyed how Tchaikovsky kind of built up the city that it's all about, Ilmar, and how the structure of the book kind of played with the city as the main character. But it took me a long time to get into it. I think I re-listened to the first 1 or 2 hours a few times, or actually to the first 3, 4, 5 hours a few times until I got into it. The audiobook is about 20 hours long, so it's a big book. But once I got into it, once I had an idea of the characters and what Tchaikovsky was building, I did kind of fall in love with it. Ilmar is full of fascinating details. It's full of different kinds of people. And the idea of this city under threat, a city that is trying to figure out who it is while under oppression from another regime, another empire, and how it's different people who are otherwise so divided, how they can come together in the face of that oppression. I think that was really interesting. It's become extra relevant in the past week or so, I would say, this idea of how do we resist? How do we come together? Yeah, I think Tchaikovsky creates a really rich world. That's also what I know from some of his other books that I've read. And I hope you can't hear my cat running around like a maniac in the background, but if you can, apologies in advance. He has the zoomies. So yeah, it's a very rich world that he creates. The structure isn't the easiest. For a more detailed discussion of this book, I would say have a listen to the episode on fantasy books. And that actually also counts for the next few books I read, because I reread The Queen of the Tearling trilogy by Erika Johansen. It starts with The Queen of the Tearling, which came out in 2014, then The Invasion of the Tearling in 2015, and then The Fate of the Tearling in 2016. I spent quite a while talking about this trilogy in that episode on fantasy as well. As you can tell, I do my reading, I do my homework for these episodes. But I raced through it again this time. I read it over the course of a weekend, of a long weekend, admittedly, this trilogy. And I just really enjoy the world Johansen creates in this trilogy. I enjoy the main character. I really like how adventurous Johansen is with genre, how her fantasy turns into a dystopia, into a sci-fi novel. And yeah, I really should read more by her. I should have a look at what else she's written recently, because I can only imagine her craft has grown since then. I do know that there is one that came out a year or so ago, The Kingdom of Sweets, which I wanted to read. Apparently it's a take on the Nutcracker, so that could be fun. I'm not necessarily a big fan of the Nutcracker generally, but hey. There is also another book which is part of the Queen of the Tearling, trilogy. It kind of makes it a series. It's called Beneath the Keep, and it focuses on one of the characters from the Tearling, if I'm not wrong. And that one I should probably also get to soon. So anyway, that was my start of the month. Those were the books that I was reading to prepare for the fantasy episode, etc. Took a break from fiction and fantasy to focus on an academic book, one that focused on emotion and how the body is conceptualized in Old Norse literature by Marie Novotná. That one was also quite interesting. Not everything I read I necessarily fully agreed with, but I think it was an interesting impulse for my own work. So I'll see how that book might influence my work. But then I wanted to go back to fantasy, and so I decided to reread another book I loved, which was For the Wolf by Hannah Whitten. It's the first of, I think, the duology called The Wilderwood. And as the name implies, this is a fun take on the Red Riding Hood fairy tale legend. It's about a first daughter and a second daughter. The first is for the throne, the second is for the wolf, and the wolf is for the wood. So the second daughter, Red, she's known all her life she's meant to go into the wood to kind of be sacrificed to the wolf. But of course, then when she ends up in the wood, not everything is as it seems. What I like about this book is how Hannah Whitten switches back and forth between Red and her sister. And her sister is lost in her own machinations. She is for the throne, so there's politicking, but there's also issues of faith and also love. There is some romance here, and I think it's built up quite nicely. And I still haven't read the second one, which is called For the Throne, so I should probably get to that. There's also plenty of other books that Hannah Whitten has written, which I'm very eager to get into, especially The Nightshade Crown. I think it's a trilogy by now. Again, I can only apologize for my cat racing around. So anyway, those I also want to read. Can you tell that I'm trying to do a more casual approach to this whole book podcasting? Okay, after that, I did have to return to reading something for work because our semester has started up again. I'm teaching a new course, and one of the sagas of Icelanders that I wanted to teach for the first time is Egils saga Skalla-Grímssonar. This is a saga of Icelanders, also known as Íslendingasögur, and Egils saga is quite a famous one, which I'd never properly read before. I'd kind of flown over it, but not necessarily read it in as much detail as I definitely need to in order to teach it, but also if I might want to use it in my own work at some point. This is a saga about the life of Egils, Skalla-Grímssonar, so he's the son of Grim, whose nickname is Skalla. And he lived in the 10th century. He was both a warrior and a poet, but he was also a farmer. And what is really nice about this saga is how much insight you really get into Egils. Because he is a fighter, there is some intense warfare. Because he's a poet, there's a lot of long poets. Because he's a farmer, you're going to see some farming as well. But it's really nice how this saga stretches across the life of Egils, I would say. Of course, the first part of the saga, as is usual with the sagas of Icelanders, focuses on his grandfather and father to kind of set up this family line, really. But that bleeds very nicely into Egils' own life. And then you get, the anger of the king. You get naughty poems told at the wrong time. Egil, who lives in Iceland, is constantly feuding with the kings of Norway. There's some unexpected amount of vomiting and drinking in this saga as well, which I look forward to talking about with my students. And there is some battles taking place in England. And the nice thing about the saga is that we also get to see Egil as an old man. Usually sagas don't spend as much time, in my personal experience, on the aging process, on what happens to these heroes or these important men when they get older. And this saga shows that in a very interesting way. And also what it does to such a manly man when he's suddenly old and perhaps no longer able to fight or to compose poems as quickly, because composing poetry was a highly regarded skill. Similarly, I believe, if I'm not incorrect in my reading, as it was in feudal Japan, for example. Being able to produce a poem on the spot which is smart, which is clever, which is a bit biting, was an incredible skill. And, well, those mental faculties also change as you get older. So it's really interesting to see that. Especially for those people who are interested in reading the sagas but don't necessarily know where to start. I can recommend Egils saga because it does really focus also on the inner life, to the extent that medieval literature does that, of Egil. You get a real sense of who he is and what his odd kind of characteristics are, and what the relationships are between him and his family and other people that he encounters. And it's a really nice introduction to how these Icelanders are set within their wider world in these sagas, because he travels to Norway, to Denmark, to England, and you realize even though Iceland feels like such a maybe isolated island up there, it was in the center of the northern world, and especially in the sagas where they also position themselves that way, right? So I can recommend that one. Having spent some time in the Middle Ages, I wanted to then spend some time far, far away, and I read New Adventures in Space Opera, which is a collection of short stories edited by Jonathan Strahan. Space opera is like a subgenre of science fiction, and Strahan in his introduction kind of talks about what space opera is as a genre. It's meant to be these grand romantic narratives which are resolutely set in space, or at least away from Earth, but a lot of it should also take place in space. And with grand romantic narratives, it's not necessarily that romance is at the heart of it, but there are meant to be these narratives that stir emotions in you, whether it's awe or wonder or anything else like that. So, as is expected with a short story collection, there are a lot of different stories in this one, and I can't necessarily talk about all of them, but I will say that each story, they were selected and curated really well, I believe, because they all melded together in a way where they remained distinct, but together they really gave me a good overview of what the space opera genre has to offer, right? So the first few stories or the names rather, of authors that drew me to this collection were Arkady Martin, T. Kingfisher, and Lavi Tidar. Arkady Martin wrote a story called All the Colors You Thought Were Kings, which is in this collection, which is kind of like a coming of age story, but it's also a story about sort of an ascension to empire, about body modification, about friendship. It was really interesting, and it was beautifully descriptive in the way that a memory called Empire also is. T. Kingfisher's story is Metal Like Blood in the Dark, which had a sort of fairy tale-like tone to me. It's about a brother and a sister who are robots. They've been created, but they also have this growing consciousness. And suddenly they're kind of left on their own in space, and it's about sort of the journey that they make in awareness as they start encountering people other than their creator. Lavi Tidar's story in this, which is called The Old Dispensation, that one was, I think the word I used in my review was mind-expanding. It's about a galactic empire, but it's grounded in Jewish theology and storytelling, and it plays... I can't really explain even the things that it plays with, but their take on such a galactic empire and what might happen when it's so deeply founded and rooted in a religion other than maybe a Christian one, which you can kind of see those Christo-fascist marks in like the Star Wars galactic empire, right? And this was it was very different, and I enjoyed that immensely. But I will say that the story that got to me most was Immersion by Aliette de Baudard. I don't know if her name is meant to be pronounced French, but I think I just attempted that. This one it's such a stark tale about identity and colonialism and technology. It's about these people who live, I believe, on a moon or on a station that is part of a wider empire. And there's this technology, which is almost like a band you put around your head, and it creates something of an avatar. And that avatar is then what people see, and it is set to look like people from the empire or from the ruling kind of peoples, whereas the people on this station or moon look very different. There's one character, and she's so stuck in her avatar that she can no longer really connect to who she used to be, to the people around her. And it was heartbreaking, and it was described in such a good way how when another culture or nation comes in, it attacks the very identity of who you are. So that was beautiful. Not every story in this collection necessarily hit the spot for me, but that is to be expected. But as I said, I think they all worked together very well, and I had an absolutely lovely time reading New Adventures in Space Opera. So dive into that. Then I had to go back to work. And I read a book by Caroline Larrington called Approaches to Emotion in Middle English Literature. That was very interesting as well. If you're interested in what emotion might look like in the Middle Ages, specifically in Middle English literature, but I can definitely recommend her book. I think the introduction is quite accessible to give you an overview of how scholarship has talked about emotions in literature and what the various things are that we look at. I find studying emotion very interesting, so emotion within literature specifically, because it gives me an insight sometimes into my own emotions as well, which is only ever useful. So yeah, have a go at that if you're interested. The next book I read is a book that if I had finished it slightly earlier, I would have included it in my episode on fantasy endings and worlds, and that is The West Passage by Jared Pechacek. This one came out this year in July, and it's stunning. And for this one, I'm actually going to read you the blurb. The ladies reign, the palace rots, the beast rises. When the guardian of the West Passage died in her bed, the women of Grey Tower fed her to the crows and went back to their chores. No successor was named as guardian. No one took up the fallen blade. The West Passage went unguarded. Now snow blankets grey in the height of summer, foretelling the coming of the beast. The two young mother of Grey House and the guardian's unnamed squire set out to save their people. Their narrow shoulders bear a heavy burden. Before them lies the West Passage, home to horrors and delights that defy imagining. None can say if they'll reach their destination, but one thing is for sure, the world is about to change. I adored this book. It took me a hot second to get into it, but that was because, as I explained in my review for this book, but also a little in the intro to the fantasy book episode a few weeks back, I read a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, which means that when I go into a new fantasy book, I often kind of have my pre-settings already saved, if that makes sense. I already kind of know what I'm going to expect, what the potential structure of the story might be, what the world might look like. And those pre-saved settings kind of help me arrive in the world quite quickly. And Pechacek just did something completely different. I read things in this book I'd read nowhere else. And I've said that a few times now about some fantasy books because there seem to be excellent ones coming out nonstop. But The West Passage truly surprised me on almost every page. It has a medieval feel to it, yes, but then there are also aspects to it which felt very Enlightenment or on the cusp of Industrial Revolution. There is a big emphasis on storytelling. So what are the stories that we tell ourselves about our world, about our city, about ourselves and our towers? How can these stories help and how can they hinder? There are ladies who are giants. They have cuboid heads. There's bees. There is a very surprising couple of things. I was going to tell you some things, but no, you should go into this book with as little information as possible. But I will say its two main characters. There is Pell, who is a young apprentice in the Grey Tower, and she eventually becomes one of the women of Grey Tower, at which point her name becomes Yarrow. And then there's Q, who is this apprentice of the Guardian who has died. And although they do both set out from Grey Tower, they don't set out together, but their journeys are mirrored in certain ways. They are journeys of discovery in more ways than one, because they're learning about themselves, about their place in this world, but they're also actively learning about the world. They've never left the tower before. So everything that they see for the first time, we see for the first time. And on top of that, there is a delightful narrative voice, which is like, and this is where they went wrong. So it almost feels like the narrator is in cahoots with us and kind of reading the story and commenting on it as we might think about it. So absolutely do yourself a favor and read The West Passage by Jared Pechacek. It also has a beautiful, beautiful cover. The next book I read is We by Yevgeny Samyatin. I did an entire episode on that, so you do not necessarily need to hear more about it. But that one was very fun as well. And with that, we reached the last book I read, which is The Village of Eight Graves by Seishi Yokomizo. And this is one of the Kosuke Kindaichi detective crime novels, of which I've covered one before. This one is apparently number 3 in that entire series. I listened to this as an audiobook again, and I will say that although I enjoyed it, because I enjoy how Yokomizo builds a tension over a narrative, this one was quite different, mainly because the person who narrates the story, so not the narrator of the audiobook, but the kind of the narrator within the book itself, is very much at the heart of the crimes that are happening, of the tension, of the mystery. And he doesn't necessarily have as much contact with Kosuke Kindaichi as the characters do in other books, like for example the Honjin murders, which means that it is less a book focused on Kindaichi and more on this other person, which was absolutely fine, but I missed our detective a little bit. And there is quite a lot of violence in this book. And a lot of it is also interestingly gendered in a way where I'm like, oof. And although there is always a clear judgment on it, there were parts of this that I didn't enjoy as much. And the kind of resolution at the end also didn't necessarily do it for me. But the rest of this series that I've read at least is still excellent. And maybe this one just wasn't entirely for me. So yeah, that was my October reading. And I'm quite happy, like I said, with everything that I read. It was a good month. I think I had a good mix between different things. And there was a strong emphasis on fantasy, I hear you, but there almost always is with me. And since then, I've dived back into some of my favorite books, like The Angel's Game by Carlos Ruiz Zafon. I decided to do that one as an audiobook a week or so ago because I needed a little bit of distraction. Dan Stevens narrates that. It was perfect. I love Carlos Ruiz Zafon. I've also read Queer as Folklore in the past few weeks by Sacha Coward, which is a deep dive into, well, folklore, as the title suggests, but kind of with a desire to uncover how these monsters or mythical creatures that we might see in folklore have been a part of queer life. I think that's how it's phrased in the blurb. And I thought that was really interesting. And I did realize during the reading that with as much academic literature as I read, I'm used to a certain approach towards material, especially literature, etc., right? That is very backed up in footnotes and evidence, that tries to limit kind of personal reading as much as possible, in the sense that the things that you believe you find in text, you need to back them up with more than just your own feeling. And that is something I have to do in my own writing. But of course, popular academic books or popular science books, the way Queer as Folklore kind of is, doesn't necessarily have to do that to the same extent. So I kind of had to adjust my own expectations, because I will question everything, which is in the nature of my work. I'll be like, but why do you think that? Where is the evidence for that? Why are you making that link, right? And that's not what this book is. This book is meant to kind of open up folklore to you and to explore the queer history that might be behind it, the way it's been adapted by queer people, or the way it's been used against them. I will say that Queer as Folklore focuses particularly upon mostly European folklore, I would say, and with that I'm expanding that to include Greek and Roman mythology as well, a little bit of Eastern European. And Sacha Coward does address this in the introduction as well, because of course they don't necessarily want to take folklore or mythology that they're not as familiar with and apply a label to it that might be incorrect within those original cultures. But that does mean that you're not going to get quite as much from mythologies in other places in the world, but they are kind of sprinkled in throughout. Overall, I would say Queer as Folklore is a very interesting and I think well thought out approach to folklore from a queer perspective, and it's definitely going to give you loads of new myths and legends to read into. yeah, and that's pretty much it. So that's what I read in October. That's what I've started reading now in November. You're not going to believe this, but I've decided to reread the All Souls trilogy by Deborah Harkness as well. Sometimes I just crave a bit of witchcraft set in a university environment, okay? So yeah, that's it for me. I would love to know what you've read. And if you decide to pick up any of these books, do let me know what you thought. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.